The billionaire's son was given only 3 days to live, but a street kid did something no doctor could understand. What if he could buy every floor of the city and still fail to buy the one thing that mattered most? This is the story of Alexander Reed, man who owned towers, hotels, and private skies, and of a street kid named Arlo whose hands had never held more than a cracked cup of tea and a handful of hope. One life would test all of Alexander's power. The other would ask only for courage. Imagine having the whole city at your feet, and then getting a phone call that shows you how useless money can feel. If you're hooked and ready to follow this interesting story, click on the subscribe button, turn on notification, and tell us the city you're watching from. We want to see how far this thrilling story travels. Now let us continue. The call came past midnight. Alexander was at his office window. The city spread beneath him like a map he had drawn. Screens flickered with numbers, planes blinked on runways, and the canned whiskey in his glass tasted faintly of jet fuel. When an assistant's voice shattered his concentration, he ran before he had time to think. "Theo," the woman said, voice tight with the kind of fear no salary can silence. "It's Theo. They're saying." The rest came as noise. Alexander's suit jacket was on the back of a chair. By the next breath, he was already in his car, tires praying the avenue to get him home faster than fate permitted. At the mansion, the world he'd purchased unstitched itself. Doctors who had flown in on his jets stood with furrowed brows. Machines blinked like mechanical prayers. Wires and tape made a map across a small body that should have been sleeping in a backyard, not attached to monitors. Theo's breaths were shallow, the beeps of the machines keeping a methodical, unforgiving time. 3 days, a doctor said, voice small against the polished marble. The words landed like a verdict. Alexander dropped to his knees and took the thin, cold hand of the child he had held up above every building he'd raised. Promises gathered in his throat. Lawsuits threatened, private planes scrambled, consultants summoned, but none of it reached past the thin skin around Theo's wrist. Outside, the clock on the wall ticked like a metronome for grief. Tick, tock, tick. The sound hollowed things out. Wealth shimmered and meant nothing. Far from marble and monitors, under a highway of humming city lights, Arlo woke to the smell of wet pavement and cooking oil. He was 11, thinner than he should have been, and his feet had more memory of concrete than of shoes. Still, when the old woman near the corner handed him a cracked teacup, a ritual she kept for him, he cradled it like treasure. Senora Inés poured the hot tea with hands that had mended more broken things than most people could see. The cup warmed Arlo's palms. The world, in that small kitchen, made sense. 2 men at the next table argued about news, anchors, and deadlines. Reed's boy, 12. Doctors say 3 days, one of them said, and the words flew through the steam of Arlo's cup like a thrown stone. The street sounds dimmed. For reasons he could not name, a tug in his chest, or a memory of his sister's fever, Arlo felt the world tilt toward that glass tower. He didn't belong in hospitals. He didn't belong in satin rooms. But he had something that money did not buy, a readiness to move toward need. He left his cracked cup on the counter, pinned the teacup's warmth into his memory, and set out barefoot over a city that glared with neon and ignored with indifference. At the hospital, guards looked like sentries at a fortress. Arlo watched delivery vans, janitors, and the rhythm of entrances. He slipped behind boxes, ducked under a hand truck, and held his breath when a nurse checked a clipboard. The antiseptic smell hit him like winter. Floors shone so clean he could see his reflection, someone who had no right to be there. When the door to Theo's room opened, the city's 2 worlds met. One boy slept beneath plastic and cords. The other stood with mud still between his toes. Arlo's face was sun-hardened and gentle. Theo's cheek rested against the thin pillow like a paper kite. Arlo stepped forward without announcement. He crouched, looked the boy in the eyes, and offered his hand, small and honest. Theo's voice was a whisper. "Will it hurt?" he asked. Expectation hung in the room like in 4 drip, machines hissing, monitors giving a slow, metallic heartbeat. Arlo placed his palm into Theo's, heat against the cold. "I won't let you go," he said. And that was not bravado, but a promise carved from whatever scraps of certainty his life allowed. Outside, the city carried on and the clock kept counting. Inside, a pact had been made, an exchange of two boys' hands that would prove to be the hinge of everything. But a promise does not explain itself. It needs motion, knowledge, and sometimes a story old as the river. To understand why a boy who slept under bridges would believe he could beat 3 days, we must go back to a dusk when Senora Ines first told him of the keeper, of moon leaf that blooms once a decade, and of a rule that the world only heals when an offering is made without a ledger. The clock on the ward kept its small, lawful ticking, tick, tock. Each sound cut the air like a small accusation. Alexander Reed moved through the next 12 hours as if he could outrun the sound. Lawyers and consultants, a parade of white coats flown in on his planes, machines carted from private clinics with the same efficiency he used to move his hotel's inventories. He paced the room like a man rehearsing a ritual, touching everything, pushing aside in four-pole, smoothing Theo's blanket, searching for some lever that would change the physics of loss. Results arrived in pages and in faces. The top neurologist from Geneva, a pulmonologist with a hospital named for saints, a geneticist who had once advised a president. Each leaned over Theo, and each came away frowning. Tests returned numbers and graphs that refused to be rewritten. "We can stabilize him," one doctor offered, "but we can't reverse whatever is eating at his cells." Alexander answered with resources, machines, drugs, a private research team pulling all-nighters. They bought time, not answers. The tick-tock continued indifferent. 3 days, the lead physician had said the first night. By morning, the phrase had become a small, brutal drumbeat that ran under every decision. Alexander called specialists into the mansion, and when he could not find a cure in clinics or in labs, he called in favors, donors, and private researchers. Power dispersed into activity, but activity is not the same as healing. While the Reed household ran on frantic efficiency, Arlo's world measured seconds in smaller currency. He had a plan that fit inside a single pocket. The cracked cup left at Senora Ines's, the direction she had muttered in a voice that smelled of cinnamon and old rain, and a single coin someone had slipped into his hand because they'd once seen him give away a sandwich. He needed nothing a charter jet could buy. Only a path, a pouch of leaves, and a keeper who would listen. Arlo found the cook who worked night shifts at the hospital by following steam and spice into a back alley. The man, Julio, had noticed the street kid who'd slipped in the night before, mud on his ankles, eyes too steady to be fearful. Julio had hands that remembered the teeth of knives and the kindness of people who brought leftover loaves. When Arlo approached, the cook wiped his hands on his apron and studied him without judgment. "You hungry?" Julio asked. Arlo nodded. Julio pushed a wrapped piece of bread across the metal counter. "You been round that ward?" he said, lowering his voice. "You don't look like you belong there." Arlo told him, in the clipped sentences he kept for strangers, about the boy with wires and a clock. Julio's face softened. "Old Senora Ines has told me things like that before," he said. "Go see her. Tell her Julio sent you. And Arlo, don't get caught in places that shine too bright." Senora Ines lived in a narrow building between a laundromat and a shuttered repair shop, a place whose windows still held the warm dim of oil lamps. She had known Arlo since he was small enough to sleep in her doorway, and she kept a shelf of cracked teacups as if they were trophies. She listened to him without interrupting. He rinsed his hands and repeated his promise. Theo's 3 days, the clocks, the hospital. She made tea and let the steam do the work of history. Then she told him the story. "There's a man who lives beyond the river," she said, not as a tale, but as a map. "They call him a keeper. Moonleaf grows in a hollowed place where the water forgets to be angry. It blooms once in 10 years, when the moon is fat as bread. The leaf can mend in ways the city does not understand." "But boy," she said, tapping the rim of the teacup, "it doesn't trade with greed. It answers honest hearts. If someone comes asking for victory, for riches, for fame, the leaf will curl and refuse." If someone comes with bare hands and a single true promise, it listens. Arlo thought of the warmth in the cup, of the way Senora Ines had fixed his blisters with kitchen sal when he was small, of the time she'd given him her last slice of mango and told him the world kept score by anything but money. "How do I find this keeper?" he asked. Senora Ines folded her fingers and drew a hasty map on a torn receipt. The river path, the low bridge where the gulls nested, the old stone with the carved heart, the trail that led into the trees where light turned nearer to shadow. She warned him of 3 things: cold that cut deeper than hunger, choices that would steal what was true from him, and men who would look for miracles and want to own them. "Go with empty pockets and a full heart," she said. "And if you're asked to give something of yourself, give it without counting the cost." Back at the mansion, Alexander's anger grew precise. It sharpened at executives who spoke in euphemism and at an insurance board that insisted on protocol. He had fought competitors for markets. He had fired men with the same flick of a wrist he now used to dial numbers. Power had been his language. Now it failed him in its syntax. It was one thing to buy a skyline. It was another to face the slow, patient logic of illness. In the executive suite across town, a man named Silas Voss watched Alexander's unraveling like a chess player watching an opponent's king exposed. Silas ran a rival chain of properties and had the kind of smile that calculated long before it landed. He read the headlines like a ledger. When the 3 days rumor surfaced, he saw not a son dying, but an opportunity. Public sympathy that could be converted into leverage, a scandal that could be shaped into advantage. He pinged allies, loosened probes, and asked a favor of a man who could plant watchers outside neighborhood shelters. Small investments that cost him little and might yield a trophy the size of a broken promise. Arlo left Senora Ines with a map folded against his chest and a pair of directions hummed into his ears. "Follow the river until the stones sing. When you hear water like drums, stop. The keeper will know." He stepped onto the pavement with bare feet, and the cold of the morning met him like a fact. The city was a set of thresholds, garbage heaps, scripts of graffiti, alleys where the roofs pressed close enough you could hear someone's thoughts. He walked through them as if threading a needle, each step a small daring. Night folded into the hours, and the hours into a kind of weather. Arlo kept the tick-tock on a loop in his mind. Not the clock in a hospital, but the sound of time as a pressing thing, an urgency that smoothed his breath into longer strides. He slept in the shadow of a mural, woke to the smell of frying fish, crossed streets where taxis blew past with impatience. People who had nothing to give him gave him bread. A vendor who remembered the time Arlo had found her lost child and returned her to work, a boy who shared his water flask because he believed in coinless kindness. Each small exchange stitched him further from the city of glass and closer to the river's edge. As he neared the old bridge, mud clung to his heels, and the city skyline shrank behind him like a promise unmade. The air changed, less of exhaust, more of earth. Fireflies hovered above puddles like careless lanterns. In the dark, a waterfall sounded, not loudly, but with the persistence of something inevitable. Arlo's feet were a map of small wounds. His resolve was a band he had wrapped around his chest. He tightened the map in his hand. Behind him, unseen but not absent, interests that smelled like power began to move. Men in suits who took calls in towers, and men in cars who never got their shoes muddy received notes. Keep an eye on the boy who left the city the wrong way. Silas had placed a quiet order. No violence yet. Only watchers. And reputations would be worth more than the life of any one child if the calculus favored advantage. Arlo paused at the riverbank, listening to water that seemed to be speaking a language of movement. Ahead, trees shouldered one another, and somewhere within the dark, the keeper waited. He slid his toes into cold mud, felt the give of the earth, and for the first time since he'd knelt in Theo's room, let the 3-day clock, somewhere far away among polished monitors, become a thin, burning thread he could chase. He stepped into the trail. The city lights winked behind him until they were a smear on the horizon. The path narrowed, and beyond it the forest breathed its old green breath. The trail swallowed the city's clamor until the only sound was Arlo's breath and the occasional scrape of leaves. The moon rode high and round, a silver coin against the black. Fireflies stitched a slow constellation along the path. Every so often he paused and pressed his palm to the damp earth, bare skin against cool stone, feeling the small, steady pulse of the world. The tick-tock that haunted him had become a different thing now, an urging in his ribs, move faster. The keeper's cottage lay where the river took a deep, forgotten bend and the trees opened like hands. It was smaller than Arlo had imagined, roof sagging, chimneys smelling of smoke that tasted of herbs, and a single window threw a warm, yellow square into the dark. Vines coiled around the door as if the house had been wrapped for a gift. When Arlo stepped close, a woman's voice called from within, low and unstartled. "Come in if you have something true," the voice said. "If you come with contracts, walk on." He hesitated only a breath, then pushed the door. Inside, the keeper was not the figure from badly told tales. She was older than the city's newest towers, but younger than the oldest stones. Her face had the map of someone who had watched many seasons. Her hands were knotted like the roots outside the cottage. She was not unkind. She did not reach for him. Instead, she studied him, as a botanist might a rare sprout. "You have the hospital smell on you," she observed, as if that proved something. "You carry a promise in your chest." "What?" "For a boy," Arlo said simply. "Theo. He's dying. 3 days. Senora Ines said you might help." The keeper's eyes narrowed in a way that was not suspicion so much as measurement. "Many come looking for shortcuts. Many want bargains. The moon leaf is a thing that listens. It keeps its own counsel. Why should the leaf trust your hands?" Arlo thought of the cracked teacup, of Senora Ines pressing warmth into his palms, of the way Theo's fingers had felt cold and fragile in hospital light. He thought of the vendor who had once given him bread after he'd returned a lost dog. He told the keeper about the promise he had made in the hospital room. "I won't let you go." The keeper did not smile. "A promise is only as good as the thing you will give for it," she said. "And the leaf will ask for that thing." She led him into a garden that smelled of wet earth and mint. Moonleaf did not announce itself like fireworks. Its leaves were small and serrated, a faint luminescence at the edges, as if the plant wore moonlight along its margins. The keeper knelt and cupped a sprig between 2 fingers as one might handle a bird. "It blooms once every 10 years, she said. "It answers when someone comes without ledger or crown. But there are tests, not spectacular feats. We are not a stage, but pieces of the heart. Honesty, humility, willingness to give what matters." The first test was honesty. The keeper asked Arlo a question that pried under his ribs. Had he ever taken something he could not offer back? The memory that rose to meet, it was small and sharp. Years ago, when he was 7, hunger had taught him the language of small thefts. He had once slipped a coin from a distracted vendor's jar to buy stew for a feverish friend. He had given the stew away and lied to the vendor when the woman later noticed. The lie had cost him sleep for months. He told the keeper that story without flinching. Her jaw softened. "You gave to heal, and then you hid it," she said. The leaf does not ask for perfection. It asks for truth. The second test was humility. The keeper offered him something easy, a leather pouch sewn with thread that glowed faintly. Inside was a powder of crushed leaf and a scent like wet rain and lemon. "You can carry this back and find the finest surgeon to use it as an excuse for fame," she said bluntly. "You can sell its secret, or you can go home and kneel without asking for credit." The words were a sieve. Arlo looked at the pouch and then at the ragged seam of his own life. He took it and tucked it inside his shirt, close to his heart, not because he did not see value, but because the thought of using it for anything but Theo made his stomach hurt. "You must give something," the keeper said finally. She produced a small wooden box and opened it. Inside lay a pair of sandals, worn at the heel. "All healings require balance," she explained. "The leaf will ask for an offering. Many try to bargain, but bargains are poor soil. What will you give?" Arlo understood then. He took off his shoes, the thin, patched things that had been with him through floods and winters, and placed them in the box. When he did, a wild thing happened. His chest felt lighter, as if a stone had been taken from a bag he'd been carrying since the bridge. The keeper closed the box and nodded. "Good," she said. "That is the sort of sacrifice the leaf honors." But there was one more test. The keeper pressed her palm to Arlo's forehead and searched with a gaze that seemed to see the small wiring of thought. "Intent," she said. "The moon leaf answers intention. If you think of power or profit, if your heart is shadowed by vanity, the leaf may twist what you ask and break what you love. Keep your promise simple. Do not tell the story for riches. Do this because a boy needs his breath." Arlo swallowed. He had no playbook for fame. He had dreams of soup and work, not headlines. He promised the keeper, then agreed to the preparation. The leaf steeped in water boiled over river rocks, the tea sweetened with a drop of honey, the brew cooled by the breath of night. The keeper wrapped a small pouch for him, heavy with the smell of earth and distant rain, and gave a single instruction. "When you come to the hospital, do not demand being made king. Kneel. Speak what you must, then do." Beyond the cottage, the forest side, time was not idle. The 3-day clock drew nearer with the same remorseless certainty that had pressed on Alexander in the tower. Back in the ward, Theo's monitors had started a new, urgent rhythm. Arrhythmia flaring like a flare in the dark, and Alexander had begun to look untethered in a way that made the staff fret. He had let his guard down when he allowed Hope to come in as a person. Now, Hope had become a problem he would do anything to fix. Silas Voss, watching headlines, had moved beyond probes to action. His associates, a network of men who took advantage of gaps, had been instructed to follow any rumor of a miracle. A thin, persistent watch had been placed near the neighborhood where Arlo slept. An anonymous tip had been paid for, and a black car had sat, idle and patient, by the river road at the hours when the moon was thin. Power smelled like lookouts and plans. For Silas, anyone who could bend the narrative of a miracle could be merchandised. The keeper tightened a knot on the pouch and gave Arlo a last, practical thing. A strip of linen soaked in oils to bind old blisters, and a small bar of lichen-scented soap. "You will be slowed by hunger and by men," she said. "You will be tempted to trade the leaf for safety. Hold to your promise." Arlo left before the moon dipped. The forest closed behind him like a door. He walked with the pouch pressed to his ribs and the echo of the keeper's voice inside his head. His feet were raw where stones had bit into skin. He had given up the sandals and found a strange, patient strength in the hot ache of his soles. Somewhere beyond the trees, the city lights burned like distant stars, and the clock there beat toward a small child's breath. He moved faster. The path took him back through edges where the grass met the pavement, and as he stepped into the city's shoulder, he saw a black car parked like a shadow among shadows. 2 figures leaned against it, faces turned to the river mouth. Arlo's blood tightened. They were not the sort of men who cared for herbs. They spoke in low tones, fingers quick with devices, eyes fixed on the road that led to the wards. Arlo slipped behind a rusted fence and watched them watch. The race, he realized, had grown more complicated than steps and leaves. The leaf could save a life, but people who understood leverage would try to turn the miracle into currency. He pressed the pouch to his chest and kept moving, the keeper's test still warm in his veins and the hospital's tick-tock like a drum at his back. Tick-tock. Arlo ran the last blocks with lungs on fire and the moonleaf pouch thumping against his ribs like a tiny, frantic heart. The city had a way of swallowing people back into its appetite. Tonight, it felt like a mouth that might spit him out. He kept to the shadows, feet slick with mud and blood where the forest had chewed at his soles, and every step was an accounting against the tick and tock that had become the drum of Theo's life. The hospital loomed, all white light and glass. Security at the service entrance wore black and professional impatience. They looked like men who believed there were always rules, and that rules were how the world stayed tidy. Arlo slowed and pretended to be a delivery boy, arms empty, breath even. A guard's clipboard blocked his path. "You can't be in here," the man said when Arlo hesitated. Arlo's voice was small enough to be mistaken for a child's. "Theo," he said. The name landed like a pebble in a pond made of antiseptic. The guard's eyes flicked toward the pediatric wing, then to the naive intensity on Arlo's face. Something in the boy, no posture, no polished lies, made the guard look away. "Go," he barked, more to clear himself than to be kind. Arlo slipped in and met fluorescent light with the same stubbornness he'd carried into the forest. The corridor smelled of lemon disinfectant and exhaustion. Nurses moved like tide. Methodical, efficient faces turned toward crisis. When Arlo reached the door to Theo's room, he saw Alexander Reed already there, hands knuckled white around a chair arm, sleeves rolled back as if he might scrub away what the machines could not. For the first time since he had been young enough to chase profit with his chest, Alexander looked like a man who had forgotten what to do with the rest of his days. "I don't know who you are," a nurse began, reaching for the call bell. Protocols rehearsed themselves in her fingers. Theo's eyes opened at the sound, faint blue, like pale winter sky. He saw Arlo and, with a child's immediate trust, smiled a slice of recognition. "You," he said, breath thick. "You came." Alexander, who had negotiated with banks, closed deals with a stare, and bent law to will, did something he had never done in public before. He relinquished command. He stood up, smoothed his suit as if to find his armor, and then, without ceremony, nodded. "Let him be," Alexander said. His voice had the brittle quality despair carves into people. The nurses surprised themselves by stepping back. Arlo's hands were shaking as he set a small thermos on the bedside table. He unwrapped the linen the keeper had tied around the pouch, and the scent lifted. Wet stone and lemon, a green breath of forest that seemed impossible in a place that smelled only of bleach. He boiled water in a hospital kettle, a ridiculous, impossible improvisation, and steeped the crushed leaves with the care of someone who had been holding a promise for a long time. Theo's chest rose and fell like a bird's riffling in a cage. Machines monitored the thin thread of life. The beeps quickened whenever breath dragged. Arlo cupped the warm cup with both hands. The tea was the color of late afternoon, the steam carrying an aroma that made Alexander flinch, like rain on parched dirt. Arlo put the cup to Theo's lips and held it, coaxing the boy to sip. "Tell me about the sky," Arlo said suddenly, because there was nothing else he knew how to say that belonged to the same language as the forest or as the teacup. "Tell me when you last climbed a tree." Theo's laugh was a soft rasp that surprised the room into a lull. He took a sip, then another. The tea was warm and astringent, and it did not fix the monitors the way a surgeon's scalpel might shift a number. Healing, Arlo had learned from Signora Ines and the keeper, was not always a thing you engineered so much as a thing you invited. He whispered to Theo about fireflies and cracked teacups, about Signora Ines's hands and the keeper's tests. The words were small offerings bred against grief. Time did something odd when you were waiting for a child to breathe. It both stretched and collapsed. Arlo watched a single breath deepen into 2, then 3. The monitor's line trembled. Nurses leaned forward. The lead doctor's face, which had been set in the particular gravity of expertise, lost a measure of its surety. "We've never seen a case respond like this," he muttered more to himself than to anyone else. Alexander's knuckles whitened, then melted. Tears leaked the color of surrender. Theo coughed, a sound like someone clearing a long-held thread from a throat, and the room inhaled as one organism. Color returned subtly at first, a bloom of warmth in the fingertips, a return to pink. He blinked, his eyes clearing as if clouds had been brushed away. When he opened them properly, he found Arlo's face near his own and smiled with a childish, astonished gratitude that made the grown men in the room spill words they had no place for. Alexander, who had spent decades buying certainty, began to cry without sound, the kind of crying that reorganizes a person. Outside the glass doors, streetlights cut the night into harsh bars. Reporters who had camped like vultures at the gates twitched their cameras, waiting for an image that would make the morning headlines. Someone in PR whispered into a phone and started a list of talking points that could not contain what had just happened. Social media, instant, hungry, would soon be alight with speculation, miracle, hoax, healing, scam. The public had a way of folding miracles into narratives. They favored simple shapes. Doctors, who lived in a world of evidence, asked questions in clipped tones. "What did you give him?" the lead physician asked, bafflement chasing protocol out of his voice. Arlo, who had no vocabulary for hospital prestige, answered simply, the keeper's instruction warm beneath his ribs. He said, "A leaf from the moon." The room teetered between believing and filing this under late-night delirium. Alexander did not debate the how. He took Theo into his arms as if he might find, in contact, the measure of what had been lost and then found. For a moment, the miracle was small and private. A child's breath and the smell of an impossible leaf mingled with hospital antiseptic. Then the world, which had a way of pruning wonder into spectacle, began to log it. Phones hummed. A nurse's quiet exclamation became a whisper through the staff, and someone scribbled "moon leaf" on a clipboard like a question that needed an answer. Not everyone reacted with reverence. News had weight, and weight had a way of attracting hands that wanted to turn weight into leverage. Silas Voss, who had leaned back in a room lined with models of towers, listened to a clipped report and felt his mouth tighten. He pictured markets and talk shows, the possibility of rewriting power with a story about a miracle. If Arlo's face reached cameras, if the keeper's leaf became a thing of public hunger, there were careers, reputations, and fortunes that could be reshaped. Silas acted with the same calm intelligence he used at negotiation tables. He did not call attention to himself. He contracted men who moved in the gray where things were bought and stolen without headlines. "Bring him," he said over a secure line, voice even. "Quietly. We'll make sure no one can use him to embarrass, well, anyone." He attached a price to discretion and another price to secrecy. For him, miracles were potential currency, and currency could be rerouted. Arlo, exhausted and elated, sat on the edge of the mattress with bare feet dangling. Theo squeezed his fingers, the kind of grip two children exchange when the world seems to be making sense again. Alexander hovered nearby like a man who had learned a new language in an instant. Humility. He touched Arlo's head once, awkward and tender, the gesture of a father who wanted to say thank you and could not find a way that fit the moment. They were not safe. The night had folded witnesses into the shape of opportunity. Behind the hospital's scrubbed glass and the flashing lights at the gate, cameras would tell a story, and men with clean suits would begin to write plans. For now, though, there was only the smallness and the vastness of Theo's recovery, a child breathing, and the clumsy, pure joy it yielded. Alexander slid a hand into Arlo's, as if learning what hands could do when not used to sign contracts. And somewhere in the shadows near the river road, two men in plain clothes watched a figure move across the ward's brightly lit window and noted the boy's gait, his bare feet, the way he carried a thermos like a talisman. They took pictures. They logged the time. They turned back to their car and made a call that would make other calls. The miracle had become an entry in a ledger. They were already watching. Dawn had not yet crowned the skyline when the first blow fell. It began quiet, the sort of quiet that always smells like danger. Rubber soles on tile, the click of gloves, someone pulling a coat over their shoulders like a ritual. Men in masks moved with the economy of hired hands. No hesitation, no aim for drama, through service corridors that smelled of coffee and bleach. They had been briefed to be efficient. Take the boy, vanish before anyone could make scene. A ledger entry, nothing more. Arlo had slept on a narrow cot in a small room the hospital had offered, spare, convenient, and under the watchful eye of nurses who did not trust miracles but had the decency to respect them. He woke to the sound of machines down the hall and to the thin heat of Theo's small hand finding his. The child's breath was steady now, the monitors a calmer rhythm. Tick, tock, less accusing than before. Arlo let himself smile, a tired, private thing, and then the world changed. They came at noon. Doors burst open with the blunt disregard of people who believe they owned other people's time. Masks hid faces, but not intent. Black gloves and retractable batons screamed the sort of violence that had no patience for stories. Staff shouted, Alarms screamed, and in the scramble of clipped orders and shouts, a hand closed over Arlo's shoulder and another yanked him toward the corridor. Theo's scream braided into the metal clang of a gurney wheel. Alexander, who had only just learned how to be small before a miracle, found size in the only way left. He moved like a man who would break himself to match the violence. He lunged forward, suit sleeves catching, a fist thrown not in calculation but in panic. He was met by a gloved arm that knocked him back with the clean force of practiced cruelty. Someone else grabbed Theo, and a nurse was shoved aside. For one impossible second, the hospital became a place of running feet and raw fear. Then, as if some unspoken chord had been struck, the neighborhood arrived. It began with a cry, Senora Inez's voice, a high wounded thing, and then a flood. The vendor women who'd once given Arlo a scrap of bread, the window cleaner boys who had watched him slip past trucks, the hospital cleaner who had kept his silence the first night, the boy Arlo had once saved from a beating. Each came without order and with everything to lose. They poured through the hospital service doors like steam, carrying what they had, pans, brooms, cleaning carts, the odd frying spatula that a breakfast vendor swung with the kind of accuracy learned from years of flinging hot oil. The servants from the mansion, maids and drivers who had long ago internalized a code of deference, hesitated only for the smallest beat before joining the surge. Something smaller and truer than hierarchy had recomposed itself into a single aim. The attackers had expected to breeze through emptiness. They had not expected hands that knew the geography of the kitchen or the strength of a vendor's arm. A broom met a baton with a sound far louder than its size. A frying pan grazed a mask, and a little boy put the heel of his shoe into a man's shin and ran like the world depended on it. The tableau was not cinematic. It was messy, full of scraped knees, improvised strategy, and the kind of courage that confuses people who measure things in contracts. Alexander found himself in the middle of it, an accidental soldier whose wealth had never taught him how to swing a broom. He grabbed a mop and swung, clumsily, a shoulder, and in doing so rediscovered the simplest unit of action. Something must be done. Nurses rallied, their professional training morphing from triage to defense. A security guard who'd earlier sneered at Arlo now shoved an attacker away with the ferocity of someone who finally understood what he was protecting. By the time police cars wove through the city and lights, painting the hospital in harsh blues, the attackers were subdued not by tasers or by legal authority, but by people who had nothing to gain and everything to give. A handful of men were pinned under a tangle of arms. One of them, frantic and sweating, fumbled a phone with messages that stitched him to Silas Voss's private line. When an officer read aloud the string of texts, orders, payments, an address that routed to a shell company, the air in the ward grew thin with the simple, terrible arithmetic of exposure. Silas had miscalculated what loyalty looks like in the parts of the city he never considered currency. He had bought secrecy with money, but he had underestimated how networked people become when they have reasons other than profit to stand together. Evidence, a dropped phone, a witness who remembered a license plate, a fumbled confession in the struggle, began to form a net. The press, which had been circling for a picture of miracle, now shouted for names. The ledger that Silas had hoped to rewrite started to list his liabilities instead. Once the dust settled, the hospital smelled of coffee and blood and the smoky warmth of adrenaline spent. Theo sat shivering beneath a blanket, flustered and frightened and alive. Arlo's feet were scraped and raw. The moonleaf pouch clung to his shirt like a secret anchor. Senora Inez wept as she hugged him, tea-stained hands clutching the boy who had walked into a tower and come back with something more than the sum of his shoes. Alexander, his suit dirt-smudged, tie askew, stood before a crowd of faces that included lawyers, nurses, vendors, and press. The act of publicness had a force all its own. He could have used a statement crafted with the precision of a brand strategist. Instead, he spoke without polish, the kind of bluntness only what he'd just witnessed could license. "You were right," he told Arlo in front of every camera that had not yet been turned into accusation. "You kept your promise. Then he turned to the crowd. This should never have been left to chance. I will fix that. The words were both personal and political, a man trying to convert private rebuke into public repair. Repair, for Alexander, would not be a billboard. He signed checks that afternoon, contracts to fund community clinics, donations earmarked for school scholarships, a promise to fund training for neighborhood health workers. He adopted a name to mean something other than an entry on a balance sheet. More than the money, he offered his time. The Reed Foundation would partner with neighborhood leaders, and he entrusted Senora Inés to run a small community center with a specific mandate to listen before deciding. It was not a perfect atonement, it was beginning. Silas Voss's fall unfolded in the columns over the next week. Corporate partners distanced themselves as regulators sniffed around shell companies. Stock dips were followed by investigations. A man who had swum in scandal found himself gasping. He was not jailed in a single day, but the scaffolding of his influence creaked and, under public pressure and legal scrutiny, began to fracture. For Arlo, the consequences were immediate and intimate. Alexander Reed, who had once negotiated a plaza zoning while sipping espresso, did what no contract could have forced. He knelt down in front of a boy with bare feet and asked permission. "Arlo," he said, voice raw and steady, "would you accept a home? Not a house, because I can buy that. An actual home, with Senora Inés close by, with a place to study and a bed that does not belong to a ward." Arlo looked at the man who had once been only distant lights in the skyline. He thought of the keeper's tests, of the sandals he had left behind, of the bread vendors who had taught him how to share, and of Theo's small hand in his. "I don't know how to be in a house," he said honestly. The simplicity of that answer made Alexander laugh and then cry. "Then we'll learn," Alexander said. Together, the city itself held a quieter, truer ceremony. Theo and Arlo, out of rooms and into sunlight, stood on a street near a hospital door where an empty wheelchair sat folded, a subtle reminder of fragility and recovery. They shook hands, not as a transaction, but as two boys who had traded fear for promise. The handshake was awkward and exact and perfect in its smallness. Alexander, watching, pressed one hand to his chest as if to feel the new weight he'd been given. They watched a sunrise that washed buildings in gold. The clock, once an accusing metronome, had softened to the steady, indifferent turn of day. There would be problems. People would ask questions about moonleaf and motive, journals would demand study and proof, and there would be men who try to monetize miracle. But for that morning, the city's bright throat was full of birdsong and the smell of frying bread. Arlo kept his bare feet on the balcony's cold stone and grinned. The sunrise, he decided, belonged to everyone now. And when Alexander later told the story, he would say he had learned the arithmetic of what mattered. The balance sheet that counted not only money but courage, not only holdings but hands. The image that settled in his mind, the two boys on the street, one in overalls and one with a still faint forescar, their small hands clasped, would become the ledger he could not erase. "It turns out," he said once, to a reporter who asked for a tidy summary, "I almost bought everything. What I could not purchase was the one thing that changed me. It was not money. It was a promise kept on bare feet." And the city kept turning, but something about the turn was different. A little less polished, a little more human, a little more honest about what could be bought and what must be given. Thank you for watching this story. Please subscribe and click on the image on your screen to watch more stories.